Our fourth panel is titled "Whose Right to the City?" Of course, it's playing on, Lafayette and Harvey and many others who have worked with this idea of the right to the city. Isran Ahmed and Ahmed Alawala were supposed to be joining us today. Unfortunately, they were unable to make it. But fortunately, we do have Jeff Noonan and Josie Watson and Paul Bocking. Jeff Noonan is professor of philosophy at the University of Windsor and also interventions editor of Alternate Routes. His works include Critical Humanism and the Politics of Difference, Democratic Society and Human Needs, and Materialist Ethics and Life Value, all published with McGill Queen's University. And Josie Watson is an instructor in the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Windsor. So I'll turn it over to them.
Josie's done work in the community with the homeless population in Windsor, where we're from. Her main interest is homelessness as a kind of cluster of health problems. And it seemed to me, talking about her research over the last couple of years, that homelessness is just a perfect metonym for all of the contradictions of capitalism. So the first part of the paper, Josie's going to take us through some of the health dimensions of homelessness. And then in the second part, I'm going to look at some of the more political philosophical implications of how we might conceptualize an alternative, which I'm still happy to call socialism. So I'll turn it over to Josie.
Okay, thank you. I want to say I wanted to step on this box because I was afraid of looking like a bobblehead. And Carlo graciously got me this, I guess our version of austerity, standing on ceremony. So, okay. I think I was, as Jeff said, we're not going to be able to read the whole paper, so I'll just try to key on some of the important points. Okay, so more than a century ago in 1844, Frederick Engels observed that working class housing was badly planned, badly built, and kept in the worst condition. He traced the privations the working classes suffered directly to the way in which housing markets allowed unscrupulous landlords to exploit workers' need for space. Since profits could still be made, even in deplorable conditions, workers were crammed into desolate, small, wretched huts with no comforts whatsoever. Later, in 1872, Engels published The Housing Question, in which he observed a direct link between poor health and poor housing among the working classes when he noted, quote, the so-called poor districts in which the workers were crowded together, being the breeding places of all of those epidemics. What Engels demonstrated was the problem of homelessness, not simply being a problem of not having a roof over one's head, but not having access to homes that fulfill the human life requirement for access to control over a space for dignified human life. Jeff will return to that issue in part 2. Now, despite the many changes that have occurred since Engels' early observations, the crisis of homelessness still persists, even in the world's wealthiest countries. Right now, estimates put the number of men, women, and children in Canada at about 300,000, but we know that there's millions of Canadians that experience homelessness on various different measures, intervals, and so on. Approximately 40% of people renting in Ontario have difficulty affording the spaces, while over 150,000 households in Ontario are on a waiting list for affordable housing, the average wait time being about 4 years. In a study that I conducted on hidden homelessness in Windsor, 48% of the participants reported not being able to have permanent housing due to an inability to afford housing. Now, since human beings are vulnerable to the elements and other external threats, shelter, housing in the most rudimentary sense, is a basic life requirement. A society which has the resources but which does not use them to satisfy even basic life requirements is, we might say, a diseased society. However, like other social diseases, the crisis of homelessness is felt more or less intensely at different periods of time. Between the end of the Second World War and the emergence of neoliberal hegemony in the 1970s, there was significant social spending on public housing. Approximately 20,000 new social housing units were built every year. And while there were problems with this model of social housing, it did nevertheless represent a welfare state commitment to at least basic need satisfaction. As neoliberalism began to cut into social spending in favor of market-based solutions, homelessness began to emerge as a social problem. And in fact, in the 1980s, that's when we really started to see this homelessness being a crisis. And in 1982, Government funding, which provided the majority of the social housing, declined. In 1982, it provided 20,450,000 units, and by 1995 was providing approximately 1,000. Until the 1980s, homelessness was really exclusively older males, the vagabond, older male having substance misuse or abuse issues, living in single-room occupancy. It really wasn't even in the literature until the 80s that we talked about homelessness. Early outreach workers warned that homelessness was a systemic structural problem in which people were being pushed out into the margins and largely ignored by the rest of society. The government did notice. In 1990, a Liberal task force on housing warned that the housing crisis was growing at an alarming rate. In a report that Paul Martin co-authored called Finding Room Housing Solutions for the Future, they claimed that all Canadians have the right to decent housing at affordable prices. We know now that a few years later, in 1993, the co-chair of this Liberal task force, Paul Martin, oversaw the final stages of the destruction of the national housing policy. Prior to this action by Martin, thousands of units of low-cost housing had been available annually. Instead of building housing, the government began building excuses that blamed the victim. As Holchansky argues, the lack of affordable housing was reframed as, quote, a housing affordability problem, where the problem with people's inability to pay for housing was not the absence of housing, but the fact that they couldn't afford it. By the middle of the 1990s, the effects of the loss of the Canadian federal housing policy was palpable. Further federal budget cuts impacted transfer payments to the province, which then in turn cut social and public services. As well, provincial investments in public social housing diminished as those relying on social housing were forced into the market rental system. Increased numbers of people were forced to try to survive on the street. And then we had the Golden Report in 1999, which basically summarized all homelessness being caused by poverty, lack of appropriate community services for people with psychiatric illnesses, and lack of affordable housing. And those causes remain today and are even more magnified. Other countries also were experiencing a similar pattern of growing homelessness. Notably, the United Kingdom and the United States were also in the process of restructuring national housing policies in the 1980s. The restructuring in the UK and the US decreased public housing and construction of any new additional housing stocks. There was an overall increase in privatization of land and the redevelopment of social housing stock through market-driven strategies and mixed tenure plans. The 1990s saw mixed tenure or mixed income strategies together with gentrification developed with the aim to revitalize blighted social public housing neighborhoods emerge as a global trend. However, while this push towards gentrification had the effect of displacing the homeless from visible areas in the center of revitalized cities, it did not solve the problem of homelessness. The problem, recall, is not simply a matter of not having access to shelter. It is a complex and comprehensive problem that affects all dimensions of a person's well-being. When we look at homelessness through the lens of the social determinants of health, we can understand the true damage it causes to people's life and well-being. The social determinants of health model emerged as researchers sought to explain how experiences of daily living conditions in conditions of structural inequality and access to basic life requirement satisfiers influence the health of individuals within a population. I'll just not go over the whole history of that, but the social determinants of health are the social and economic conditions which shape lives and determine the health of individuals in society, insofar as they regulate the availability, quality, and quantity of social and economic resources. In the social determinants of health model, health is not reduced to an abstract physical state of individual functioning, but is focused on the range of activities that people are capable of undertaking as social beings. Though many intertwined variables contribute to homelessness, studies have shown that poor quality housing is an independent variable for poorer health outcomes. People experiencing homelessness report a wide range of physical, psychological, and social health issues. some of the things that I found, like Meg and Patricia, dental was the number one thing that people complained about in terms of their physical health, followed by cardiac, respiratory problems, infectious diseases, and foot problems. And that's really due to the fact that people that are homeless walk around all the time. They usually can't afford to take public transit. They generally have ill-fitting shoes that may be wet and so on, so this causes a lot of actual physical problems to the feet. Now, while it may be easy to calculate medical and psychological diagnosis through self-report, it is not so easy to calculate the health toll on an individual's overall functioning where social and material deprivation exists. All the participants in my study experienced social exclusion. The complexity of social exclusion is associated with poverty and the implications of poverty, such as homelessness. The participants experienced social exclusion as a result of homelessness, which diminished quality social supports, increased risky behaviors, and compromised physical and psychological health. Participants described forms of marginalization, for example, being restricted from shelters due to their substance abuse history. So, just to summarize that, we do have a lot of real costs of homelessness. And yet it seems absurd that a country as wealthy as Canada has a mass homelessness crisis. According to Hulchansky, Canada's housing system relies heavily on the real estate market for its supply of housing stock as well as its distribution. Markets respond only to demand, and demand requires money. People who are homeless cannot contribute to the housing market because of a lack of money, and they are therefore ignored by the market. Hulchansky criticizes analysts who argue that homelessness is the result of a lack of income rather than a lack of affordable housing, because in this form of logic, housing is not understood as a basic life requirement, but rather as a commodity. Hulchansky shows that the problem with Canada's housing system is the inadequate, irrational structural organization of the system. That is, the system does not provide homes to all who need them, but private dwellings to those who can pay. While solutions have been difficult to come by, plans to solve the crisis have not. In keeping with neoliberal orthodoxy, the dominant approach in the absence of a national housing strategy has been to look to tax incentives, the market, and private developers to provide affordable housing. For example, recently Mitchell Cohen, in a recent Globe and Mail article, lauded Toronto Mayor John Tory for, quote, introducing a range of tools to help create affordable homes in every new community in the city. The city will defer to waive taxes, levies, and development charges, and, perhaps as importantly, fast-track approvals for development applications and incorporate a significant percentage of affordable rental or ownership housing. What counts as affordable, he does not say, and how the most vulnerable and poorest will access this housing is a question he does not address. Instead, he looks to progressive developers to solve the problem, and I quote him again, another potential star coming into alignment is in the form of a new generation of private sector developers. The older generation knew one thing only, tract subdivision housing at an average of 4 units per acre. Today's generation has embraced intensification, and with it a broader sense of corporate social responsibility, and understanding that the development business can become a platform for a healthy bottom line. It can become a platform for progressive social change, and that healthy, mixed-use, mixed-income communities will also be healthy for their bottom line. We of course do not claim that all developers are the same, or that it is in principle impossible for private developers to be genuinely concerned with affordable housing. At the same time, if Hulchansky is correct and Canada's market housing systems contribute to a lack of adequate and affordable housing, it is difficult to believe in market-based solutions when Canada's most vulnerable people live in a society in which access to one of the essentials of human life is priced beyond their ability to pay for it. The problem is that ultimately the bottom line will get in the way of completely solving the problem. At some level, meeting the needs of the poorest will prove unprofitable, and they will be ignored, or the satisfaction of their needs will require non-market-based solutions beyond what the invisible hand of the market will bestow. To substantiate this claim, let us examine the much-touted success story, which Carl talked about in his presentation this morning, Regent Park. I won't go through the history of that, but it really has become the most celebrated experiment to date. The mixed income neighborhood solutions to the blight were touted as the right thing to do for people living in what had become unsafe and inadequate housing in neighborhoods. These solutions have been criticized for displacing people from their homes through deconcentration and gentrification, theorized as a modern spatial engineering solution designed to decrease the spatial distance between renters and owners. The mixing of tenures or classes, it is thought, will improve the lives of poor people by giving them access to networks and opportunities not available in strictly social public developments. While the development of Regent Park has created new buildings, galleries, community centers, shopping concourses, and improved the appeal of the neighborhood, not everyone agrees that this alternative to blight is the best one. August presents the voices of those who were displaced during the redevelopment of Regent Park, who reported minimal consultation from housing authorities and a fear of speaking out against the redevelopment for fear of losing secure housing. August described a sense of powerlessness among tenants of Regent Park who did not believe they deserved to question alternatives to the gentrification prior to the redevelopment, with limited choices available. So, if not the market, what can we turn to? When we turn to the dominant conception of non-market solutions, the move to assert housing as a right stands out. We will discuss the drawbacks of that in part 2. Here we want to examine briefly the history and contemporary state of the movement for housing as a right. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, declaring in Article 25(1) that housing is a human right. Canada is a signatory to this declaration, as well as further declarations, including the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Recently, this was in the news in February 2016, Canada was harshly criticized by the UN agency responsible for monitoring enforcement of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights for its lack of progress and attention to its homelessness crisis. The report cited several problems, including absence of a national housing strategy, inadequate housing subsidy within the social assistance benefit, shortage of social housing units, increased evictions related to rental arrears, increased numbers of homeless and lack of homelessness prevention, shortage of emergency shelters, laws that penalize people for being homeless, lack of adequate housing for people with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities, and the poor housing conditions of Canada's Indigenous peoples. We, of course, concur with this criticism and do not disagree in any dogmatic way with the appeal to the right to shame governments into resuming their responsibilities for public investment in affordable housing. However, we want to argue that if access to housing is a right, it is a right because human beings have a need for homes, and by focusing on the level of need or life requirement, the depth contradictions of capitalist markets are brought more clearly to light. As Engels pointed out, the poor can be housed without their real need for homes being addressed. The human need for a home is both an organic need for shelter and safety and a social need for private space, not space in which no one is allowed to enter, but rather space in which the person's own decisions regulate who enters and who shares it with them. When we are homeless, we lack this basic natural and social life requirement. Thank you.
There's still part 2, but I'll be quick. So, I think what Josie illustrated quite clearly is that the fundamental contradiction of capitalism, when we look at it not from a strictly economic standpoint, but from the standpoint of it as a value system which distributes not only commodities, but distributes commodities and resources in ways that it calls good, and therefore provides justifications for itself in its ways of distributing, is deeply contradictory. Because the goods it primarily distributes, money and the commodities that money allows you to access, are not distributed in ways that ensure everybody who needs them gets access to them. Right? And so the homeless situation it exemplifies for me this contradiction between what I've called in other work the life requirements of human beings and the system requirements of capitalism. And it exemplifies it, especially in Canada, where despite global warming, the weather can still kill you, as OCAP brought to everyone's attention just a couple weeks ago when there was a cold snap here. Right? Particularly where we live in an environment which can kill us if we're exposed to the elements, to not provide even the basics of that. And I'll come to the problem with housing in our ironic title in a minute. But to not even provide the basics of that exemplifies the deeply problematic way in which we live. And let's face it, it's not difficult to supply the minimum required to keep people safe from the elements. It's an extraordinarily rich country. So why doesn't that happen? Because if we don't question markets at a fundamental level, right, if instead we look to them as the only possible solution, or at least the default solution, right, we don't get to the root of the problem, right? Neither do rights, and here's where I want to kind of make a bit of a political and philosophical argument. I've made it before in the past, and since I'm at York, I should acknowledge that one of the main influences in this critique of rights was the work of Ellen Wood, who is the great political philosopher here, just passed away. I don't know if some people, I think, her colleagues would know her. Not everyone does, but if you don't, you should definitely get a copy of Democracy Against Capitalism, because it, I would say, is the best work of Marxist political philosophy of the last part of the 20th century. So that her work was very influential in this critique. The basic argument is this, right? I'm not dogmatic or sectarian. It makes rhetorical sense, given the political history of liberal democratic capitalism, to anchor claims on public goods and rights. But what grounds the right, and what is the function of rights in the history of capitalism? I would say on the one hand, and I'll come back to this point in a second, legitimate rights on public resources are grounded in our needs for them, right? And the problem with the way rights function in capitalism, right, is that they do not contest the basic structural problem of capitalism, which is the universally required life resources that everybody needs as a human being are controlled by a minority class who exploits them to get us to function as workers and to make money for themselves. If you just look at the recognized and acknowledged rights in the human rights corpus of the UN, right, there are dozens and dozens. But if you try to see if they can be consistently realized, you'll soon discover that they cannot. Because on the one hand, you have the right to private property, which legitimates the ownership and control of housing by landlords, private owners, right? On the other hand, you have countervailing rights, economic and social rights, that try to claim some of that back. But they don't negate the legitimacy of the right to private property. They don't contest it, right? And so if you don't contest that fundamental right to private property, you don't ever get to the root of the problem, which is not to say, of course, that you shouldn't try and ameliorate immediate social problems. If the room caught on fire, hopefully someone would put it out, or the fire department would come and put it out, right? But the fact that we have to put out fires doesn't mean that we shouldn't also think about fire prevention. And the fact that we should also think about fire prevention doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and engineer materials that don't combust, right? So our view here is a little longer term. This is not a policy paper. There are people far more well-versed and situated in the day-to-day struggles to deal with that. But ours is a kind of longer view. What has to be done to solve the problem of homelessness, right? And we don't think that we can solve the problem of homelessness without addressing these underlying structural issues, right? Josie started by quoting Engels 150 years ago, right? It was a problem in Manchester in 1840. It's a problem in Toronto in 2016. So clearly there's a structural issue. Okay, so let me just read the last couple of pages and try and put my point as clearly as I can. Putting the problem of homelessness in terms of life requirement deprivation highlights a key limitation of the rights-based approach. The Universal Declaration asserts that housing is a right, but it does not further define the conditions that count as having the right satisfied. All rights statements tend to be programmatic and abstract. A discussion of human life requirements, by contrast, cannot be carried out without reflection on the nature of the life that has the requirements. In other words, it is never enough to assert that X is a life requirement. One must always unpack the life value of X in relation to human life to explain just what it is that X contributes to the life which, if absent, would cause harm. If we content ourselves with the assertion that housing is a right, it is an open question what is required to satisfy the right. Does any sort of roof over one's head constitute satisfaction of the right? Are the rights of social assistance recipients housed in motels while they await public housing violated? There's no straightforward answer to these questions if we focus only on the right to housing, because it does not explain why it is that human beings need housing beyond the obvious that we require shelter. But, as the quotation from Engels from which we began illustrates, human beings can be sheltered under a roof and still threatened by exposure, if not to the elements, then to the threats that overcrowded and unsanitary living conditions cause. In other words, if we understand the right to housing as rooted in our need for security from environmental harms, not any sort of shelter will do. The human need for housing is thus at root a need for a dwelling space which allows the occupants to regulate which elements of the external natural and social environment can cross the threshold. Hence, no shelter that is overcrowded, poorly constructed, unhygienic, or not under the control of the occupants will be sufficient to satisfy the human need for housing. However, the human need for housing goes beyond the negative dimension of keeping threats out. In fact, we argue that housing, in quotation marks, itself is a problematic term because it lends itself to minimalist readings. A house is a shelter from the elements, and thus anyone who is not directly exposed to the elements is not homeless. They're housed. Where public provision depends upon taxation and where taxation remains a contested political battlefield, there will always be pressure, even when there is sufficient tax revenue to fund public spending schemes, to expend the minimum necessary to avert the crisis. The satisfaction of life requirements in fully human ways, in other words, in ways which allow human beings to freely unfold their life capacities, require more than the bare physical minima. In truth, human beings do not need housing. Just as the jobless do not need jobs, i.e. just any sort of paid employment to keep them off the unemployment rolls, but rather meaningful work through which their human life capacities for creative contribution to society are realized, so too the homeless need homes, not just shelter from the elements. Right? Henri Lefebvre, I think the title of this section derives from his work, puts the point nicely, perhaps a little too idealistically, but I do want to quote it because I think he establishes the contrast quite nicely. He says, this is from the third volume of the Critique of Everyday Life, "Dwelling, a social yet poetic act generating poetry and artwork, fades in the face of housing and economic function. The home, so clearly evoked and celebrated in the work of Gaston Bachelard, likewise vanishes, the magic place of childhood, the home as womb and shell. Confronted with functional housing, constructed according to technological dictates, inhabited by users in homogeneous shattered space, it sinks and fades into the past." I don't know if people have read Bachelard's The Poetics of Space. It's wonderful. It's a little idealistic, idealized version of home, but it illustrates the point, right? Homes are central to having a sense of ourselves as dignified agents in control of our space, right? One of the most problematic aspects of homelessness is you have no control over who's in your space at any time, right? And this conception of controlling your space doesn't have to be exclusionary, right? But it engages our own decisions and our own agency and who's around us at any given time, right? How do we shape the space we inhabit? So, we've gone on longer than others, so in order to be egalitarian, let me just wrap the point up, right? Of course, we need a national housing program, but we have to also think of reinvestment in public goods as involving the agency of the people who are deprived, right? And I think this is where the role of a group like OCAP is so important, because they mobilize the energies of the people who are deprived of the resource. And they actually ask them, what would it take to satisfy the need, right? Rights can too often become the political preserve of experts, lawyers, fighting on behalf of, but not mobilizing around, right? Moreover, we have to think, as was it Doug saying? We have to think beyond the logic of market distribution of housing, and the only thing that satisfies that need is private control, private ownership of a house or a condominium. Right? The need for housing doesn't require private and exclusionary ownership. It requires security of access and control over the space. Right? but it doesn't require actual physical ownership. So we have to think of co-ops, we have to think of groups of homeless people mobilizing resources and building their own spaces, and we ultimately have to think of the struggle for homes as part of a broader struggle against the depth contradiction of capitalist society, which is the subordination of our life requirements to the accumulation of money value. And I think I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Paul Bocking, who is a PhD candidate here in the Department of Geography here at York, with interest in education policy and labor, and he'll be discussing his experiences running as a municipal candidate in Scarborough. Not over yet.
On the hustings. Okay. All right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Paul Bocking, and as Carl introduced me, I am a student here at York, and my actual PhD research is in how neoliberal education policy is transforming teachers' work. But that's not what I'm actually here to talk to you about today. What I'm going to be talking about is my experience as a candidate running for city councillor in Ward 35, Scarborough Southwest, where I live here in Toronto. Okay, so just to, as I am a geography student, just locate it. We have Scarborough and from the GTA, and then Ward 35 itself here is bounded by Victoria Park Avenue on the west. We have Eglinton Avenue east along the north, and then we have the GO train tracks along the southeast side of it. And so there's a subway line which goes up. We have 3 stations there. The northwestern corner of the ward is what's called the Golden Mile, which is formerly a major industrial area, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. Our heart is a cemetery, as evocative as that is. We have residential areas, clusters of high-rise apartment buildings, and a lot more. So to briefly speak first of all about some of the demographics of the ward. It's of the 44 wards in the city of Toronto, it's the second lowest median household income. And don't quote me on those specific numbers because National Household Survey and all the vagaries of that. But I can tell you though that it does have the second lowest median income across every number I've looked at. That is pretty consistent across the city. And as well, you can see it's a little under half of what the highest one is in Eglinton Lawrence. High rate of poverty amongst children, 12.5% unemployment rate. It's also an important home for newcomers to Canada, especially in the groups listed there. It's an area in which some of the positive things with the area we have we have the best access to TTC in Scarborough. I can say that. And it's also an area in which there is relatively more affordable housing as well too, which makes it appealing to a lot of newcomers and folks like myself who are looking for a cheap place to live. This Scarborough Southwest, since its very rapid development from about 1950 onwards, has been transformed a fair bit in the last 30 years. And one large part of that was the deindustrialization of a large part of the aforementioned Golden Mile. So, for example, there used to be a home of a GM General Motors van plant at the northwestern corner of the ward, and that is now this lovely Eglinton Town Centre Mall parking lot where you can see spaces very well utilized in the perfect suburban form. Another typical transition of land use, Pilkington Glass, once largest glass manufacturer in North America, employing many workers, is now this kind of new urbanist kind of style townhouse development that was just built 5 years ago, I think. So that's typical. Now, a lot of formerly industrial land has been transitioned either to these kind of parking lot and big box stores or to kind of these townhouse developments, and without a lot of mixture in terms of. So I mean, but the point I'm making is still extremely car-dependent form of planning. In terms of going further along on housing issues, I would say that roughly half the families living in Ward 35 live in high-rise apartment towers, and many of them are clustered around an area called Teesdale, which is near Victoria Park, or near up in the northeast near the Kennedy subway station and the Kennedy Park. And those are both neighborhood improvement areas which receive some additional funding from the City of Toronto. And some of those buildings are owned by Toronto Community Housing. And these two photos are taken from within TCHC buildings. And so these are kind of, if you want a visual representation of what the $2.6 billion of what this TCHC needs to repair, for its repairs in the next 10 years, you can have some visualizations of that here. It's hard to read this. It says magical pest control, and it's referring to a notice for tenants for this month's bed bug spraying. These are big issues in these buildings. The other half of the people the other half of families in Ward 35 tend to live in post-war single-family detached bungalows. Many of them are Southern European or Greek, they're Italian. They're senior citizens. They're living there. Their descendants are living there. Some of these houses are increasingly being bought up by newer, younger families. Some of these houses are being are being demolished, and you're having 2 or 3 houses built on one plot of land, so it's an intensification there. But more significantly, I think, there's the property values are rising very quickly in those areas. And also, just incidentally, too, Ward 35 has the 4th lowest share of the 2014-2018 city capital budget. In terms of electoral politics, in the last election, these were the results here. So Ward 35, that's actually lower than the results for Rob Ford in 2010. Rob Ford, I think it was about 56% or so for Rob Ford in my ward in 2010. The Fords swept all of Scarborough except for Ward 36. Which is a more affluent area, the most affluent area in Scarborough, I think, and where Tory won. Tory, when I would, doing the canvassing work, and I'm going to talk more about the election, the actual process shortly. Doing the canvassing work, you get to do a lot of kind of qualitative polling of people when you'd have more fulsome conversations occasionally. And so I'd ask people, I'd often ask people, what do you think about Tory, Chow, Fords? And the perception I hear often of Tory is that he's too slick, he's too corporate, he represents the rich guys, man of the people. Olivia Chow, doesn't seem like she stands for anything really strongly, I don't know. On the other hand, though, she did actually, Ward 35, that was actually her highest turnout, her highest base support in Scarborough, and it was almost in line with the overall her average across the city. And in fact, we actually got snarky emails saying, "Why is your sign beside a Ford sign?" Like, well, I can't control people, but an ideology is a funny thing, and so that's something to talk about. And that's a real picture. Okay, so why I became a candidate. I lived living in my area for several years before I ran, and I was teaching at a high school in the community, and before that I was going to U of T to do my Bachelor's of Education, and I think for the first time in my adult life I felt like I had some kind of identification with where I lived. Prior to that point, I lived in various places for a year at a time, doing my undergrad and whatnot, and it was a place where I lived and I came home to, and then I went out to do something else. But I didn't say I had any kind of broader kind, I was always involved in politics, but my political activity was not geographically defined, or was defined like the level of Toronto or something. In that period of time, while I was working in that high school, I happened to get pulled into the Scarborough version of what was happening in 2012 at various different places across the city, like the Stop the Cuts Coalition, which has been organizing against the myriad cuts that Rob Ford was rolling out and his councillors were rolling out. And so I kind of got involved in some activities around that in Scarborough, and then that's what kind of got me having more of a sense of identification with where I lived, and that's what kind of built from there. I kind of started building more kind of networks with other activist-minded people in Scarborough, and I felt it interesting in that compared to being considering Toronto kind of on an activist scale as a whole, being involved politically on the left in Scarborough actually reminded me a little bit of my time when I was living in Peterborough, Ontario, where when you get involved in kind of left politics in Peterborough, it's small enough that you very quickly start to recognize the usual faces at events. And Scarborough was kind of like that too in a way. And it was kind of this, it's much easier to kind of get a hang on of how things are working and to kind of start doing some organizing, who you need to talk to start organizing this area. And I found that actually very kind of empowering in a way, because it created the possibilities of organizing in a kind of local context that some kind of, I'm organizing downtown, I'm organizing across the city, wouldn't have unless you had massive resources. The political incumbent, Michelle Berardinetti, spouse of the Liberal member of provincial parliament for our area, of the Family Compact. She was elected in 2010, and she rode in basically on the Rob Ford bandwagon. And for the first 3 years of Ford's tenure, she was closely aligned with him on his agenda in terms of cuts to TTC, cuts to childcare services, cuts to community centers, and all the rest, privatization, outsourcing of garbage west of Yonge Street, and so on. So to try to oppose that kind of anti-austerity agenda, and feeling like I had some little bit of more legitimacy than I would have had in other places of running, I decided to run as kind of an experiment to see if by running, I could kind of basically try to build some kind of galvanize some kind of connection to more grassroots movements. The actual organizing election began about 2 years before, in about September 2012, when a group of friends and we started meeting to plan towards this eventual election. So it had a lot of advanced work. In terms of platform, these are some key points. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about them, but I could. Yeah, one thing I'll say about this with the improved TTC bus service and freeze fares, when I would go to the doors, there'd be the two most common questions I would get would be, what do you think about Rob Ford? Which is a political litmus test that everyone's trying to place you ideologically, or another version that is which political party you aligned with. The second question I would get is, where do you stand on the Scarborough subway? If you may recall, that was a huge issue, the LRT versus the subway. And I took the position that you could argue the unpopular position of supporting the LRT for a variety of reasons. And I got quite practiced in kind of debating that and arguing that point. And but that wasn't actually the key point in which I was pressing on. Arguing that one of the easiest ways to improve a lot of people's daily lives in Scarborough would be to improve the bus service, because they had been cut, a number of routes had been cut in our specific ward with the support of our councillor. That was one thing I was running on. And also this one too here, which was not something which I saw being emphasized enough in the Child campaign and in the kind of the center left as a whole of the city. And obviously I prefer to reduce the fares if possible as well. Okay, so yeah, so the campaign involved a lot of elements. They say that you got to run at least twice. The first time is just chaos, and the second time you're more comfortable, then you're much more effective. But it basically, starting out early on was so important because, first of all, the necessity of building up resources and having things like these fundraising parties. And one thing I will say, I think, which is interesting, is that municipal politics in Toronto, because of its it's more equitable fundraising and financing system than provincial or federal politics, I think it actually has a lot of untapped potential for more left-wing and more progressive candidates to try to get involved. Because of the system we have where people that donate sum of money will get a certain amount of money back, not in your taxes, but an actual check in the city of Toronto, it makes it far easier for obscure nobodies like myself to have a chance at raising some money. And so through our successes, we were able to have a full campaign in terms of, I had a full-time paid manager for the last month. We had an office. We produced tens of thousands of copies of these, and so on. And lots and lots of canvassing. The core of this all was the canvassing. And so the lovely thing about having the manager is that she took care of everything else, so that I could spend all my time just knocking on doors. So I have, just in closing here, I have a few, and I was going to say at the beginning, this is the least academic presentation of this conference. This is like the personal ethnographic presentation. that I think there's some of my beliefs coming out of my experience is the importance, in terms of political change in the city, the importance of long-term rooted organizing work, and how hard that is, given how, especially for my generation, how so many of us we move around so much. So it is hard to be rooted, and I do think that changes the kinds of campaigns you would do. It's easier, for example, it's easier to build a campaign around affordable TTC fares amongst youth than it is around specific neighborhood issues if we're moving around other parts of the city, but we're still within the city of Toronto, and we're more likely to rely on transit. Whereas the municipal scale of politics, inevitably, it privileges and really is constructed around the assumption of long-time homeowners who buy their houses and then park themselves there for 30, 40 years. And they're the ones that the councillors care about and look to and make sure they curry their favor, to make sure that when the guy complains about how the blade on the front of the snowplow on their sidewalk is cutting into his front lawn, and how he's outraged, but those people living in TCHC deserve their fates because they're just not as good people, and so on. These are attitudes that are out there, but to kind of try to overcome the systemic structural inequalities there, that's the long-term rooted organizing work requires. And one thing I did find is this importance too of creating specifically a left identity that is anchored and rooted in, and it is authentically of the inner suburbs as well too. One thing I found in a lot of the discourse that came from campaigns emanating out from a lot of groups like that are based in downtown Toronto, like the group like they had put out Together Toronto and so on, as they build these kinds of discourses like that was based on the Joe Pantalone campaign in 2010, which tried to kind of continue on from saying, well, we had it great under David Miller and the good times will continue on, and I think to a significant degree they negated the very real rising inequality that is occurring throughout our city. And I'm not going to get into the kind of analysis, which I'm sure many of you have already heard, about how the Fords were able to harness that sense of frustration with rising economic inequality in the city. And the center left in our city is absolutely incompetent in doing that to a great degree. Maybe because they don't want to acknowledge how bad it is and how to address it, what that would require. So I think to be credible, we have to directly confront the real inequalities that exist in the city. And so in terms of ideas for strategy, one I think is the idea of reclaiming the economic and living conditions. And when I started my campaign, I wanted to kind of go beyond what I thought was a more defensive position of saying that I'm against cuts and I'm against privatization and outsourcing and so on, and try to advocate some new policies and new proposals that didn't already exist. And one thing I found challenging is that I feel that there's a real lack of left intellectual policy work that happens at the municipal politics. So I had a lot of help from some friends of mine here in geography at York, and I'm looking one right now, who is excellent. And some other circles, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, people involved in the labour movement in Toronto. But on the whole, from the little work I did contacting people, there's a dearth of ideas. And there's some interesting ideas that are on the margin, like Kristen Wongtam, the downtown councillor's idea of a municipal bank. I think is something which I think deserves a lot more exploration. There's Mayor Simiatiki's from Ryerson University's idea that he just put out in January around the city budget of basically introducing brackets to the residential property tax, so making it like income taxes, so people who had houses that are valued under $400,000 would pay a smaller percentage than people whose houses or properties are worth over $2.5 million. I think that's a very interesting. Proposal, and I think it's a very progressive proposal. And so I also have a big critique as well of policies that come out that seek to try to remedy the very real fiscal crunch the city has, but by introducing what are in essence flat taxes, like roll tolls. And so that's why I'm not in favor of roll tolls, for the obvious socioeconomic equity context of them. But I think that there is lots of interesting ideas that would be equitable, like the one I mentioned there. So that's about all I have to mention here. Yes, thank you very much.
And I thank our three presenters here for ending on an optimistic note that there is opportunities not only for a left populist alternative, but for more substantive, progressive, non-marketized aspects, but even radical alternatives as well. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to our panelists for a very interesting discussion. I will just give you for 30 seconds if I can. Thank you to everybody for what we think was a very successful series of panels and discussions today. Thanks to our keynotes and all presenters that facilitated the discussions, and everybody for taking part. Before I end, I'm gonna pass it over to Steve, but I do want to ask everybody to please keep an eye out for AR's subsequent issue and call for papers. We can tentatively announce that next year's, so this was the first year that it took place at York, actually. Next year will be our first international conference. So I'll turn it over to Steve, who has some announcements about food and our reception that's following us right here.